The South China Sea is again the scene of a tense maritime confrontation, and the flashpoint this time is Reed Bank, the shoal known in the Philippines as Recto Bank, an energy-rich stretch of water west of Palawan, long coveted for its gas potential. In early May 2026, Philippine surveillance aircraft and Coast Guard patrols reported that a Chinese oceanographic research vessel identified as Xiang Yang Hong 33 was operating near Iroquois Reef and Reed Bank inside waters Manila considers part of its exclusive economic zone. The sighting, authorities say, was accompanied by a coordinated presence of a China Coast Guard vessel and numerous vessels linked to China's maritime militia. The episode quickly sparked a diplomatic protest from Manila and a renewed call for vigilance from the Philippine Coast Guard. The commandant of the Philippine Coast Guard, Admiral Ronnie Gil-Gavan, responded firmly. He said, "We will continue to challenge any illegal activities that undermine our sovereign Gondini and sovereign rights." That statement underscored a posture Manila has adopted in recent years, more transparent, more assertive, and more willing to publicly document and challenge activities it deems intrusive. The Coast Guard says it recorded the research vessel deploying smaller service boats and conducting operations that Philippine officials interpret as unauthorized marine scientific research. Commodore J. Territorial, the Coast Guard spokesman for the West Philippine Sea, told reporters and posted official statements describing the activities as unlawful within Philippine jurisdiction. He warned that in the Coast Guard's assessment, they are conducting illegal marine scientific research without the legal authority or prior consent of the Philippine government. For the Philippines, Reed Bank has acquired strategic urgency because of its potential to help offset declining domestic energy production. The giant Malampaya gas field, once the country's main source of offshore gas, has been producing less and less over the past decade. Philippine energy planners see Recto Bank as one of several possible domestic sources that could ease pressure on imports and bolster energy security. That makes any external activity, scientific or otherwise, in the area highly sensitive. Manila's concern is not merely about a single ship on a single day. It's about patterns of presence, data collection, and what those patterns might mean for future resource exploitation and maritime control. The broader context is a decades-long multi-state contest over the South China Sea's islands, reefs, and the maritime zones that surround them. Several coastal states, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, maintain claims that overlap with China's sweeping historical claims. In 2016, an international arbitration tribunal largely rejected Beijing's most expansive map-based claims, a ruling the court found incompatible with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Beijing has routinely rejected that ruling and continued to assert its own claims while building up naval, Coast Guard, and civilian presence in disputed waters. That rejection of the tribunal's decision has become a central source of friction with neighbors that insist maritime activities inside an exclusive economic zone require the coastal state's permission. China, for its part, frames many of these operations as lawful and routine. Chinese authorities routinely describe research missions as scientific or environmental in nature and say their vessels are operating within areas they consider part of China's maritime domain. In public statements, Beijing insists that such missions are legitimate and that claims should be settled through bilateral negotiation among claimant states rather than international adjudication or through outside intervention. What complicates the picture is the variety of vessels that now populate disputed sea lanes alongside Coast Guard cutters and Sea. Wreck ships, analysts, and regional navies have identified a dense layer of so-called maritime militia, ostensibly civilian fishing or supply vessels that may be coordinated to assert presence or to support state goals. Philippine patrols reported dozens of such militia-linked ships in recent operations. In one of the patrol reports, officials said at least 28 militia-linked vessels were monitored near Thitu Island, the Philippine-occupied feature in the Spratlys, locally called Pag-asa, during the same general period of heightened activity. For Manila, a persistent swarm of civilian-style boats backed by Coast Guard ships and occasional naval escorts creates enduring pressure and complicates maritime operations that would otherwise be handled by military or paramilitary forces forces alone. The use of oceanographic research vessels raises its own set of concerns. Scientific mapping and survey missions can legitimately gather hydrographic, biological, and environmental data. Those data are essential for fisheries management, habitat preservation, and maritime safety. But the same sensors and survey equipment also collect seabed mapping information, bathymetric data, and geophysical intelligence that can be used to chart undersea terrain, locate potential hydrocarbon deposits, and plan infrastructure or military operations. In disputed, energy-rich areas like Reed Bank, that dual-use character of marine science is precisely why coastal states demand authorization for foreign research inside their exclusive economic zones. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, marine scientific research within a coastal state's EEZ and on its continental shelf generally requires that state's consent. Manila says it granted no such consent for the Xiang Hong 33's activities near Reed Bank. The Coast Guard's surveillance logs and public briefings describe the deployment of small boats, apparent survey operations, and proximate positioning near reefs and shoals that this Philippines regards as sensitive. Philippine patrols recorded the events by air and by sea, and the government publicly signaled its intent to maintain patrols and to document any recurrence. Officials stress that public transparency is intended to deter escalation, to inform Filipino citizens about what happens in their waters, and to raise international awareness. The episode comes amid a period of intensified regional diplomacy and security realignment. Under the current administration of President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the Philippines has stepped up patrols, made a practice of releasing footage and reports publicly, and strengthened security ties with allies and partners, including the United States, Japan, and Australia. Washington has repeatedly criticized what it calls coercive maritime behavior in the South China Sea and has publicly reaffirmed defense commitments to the Philippines under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, particularly in the event of an armed attack on Philippine forces, public vessels, or aircraft. China, in turn, accuses outside powers of inflaming the situation and contends that such disputes should be handled regionally and bilaterally. And there is a domestic political dimension as well. Public opinion in the Philippines has shifted over the past several years toward greater skepticism of China's maritime intentions. Repeated confrontations, ranging from water cannon incidents and close-quarters maneuvers to the blocking of resupply missions to small Philippine outposts, have hardened public sentiment. Polls show rising distrust and stronger support for transparency initiatives that document incidents in the West Philippine Sea, a term Manila uses for parts of the South China Sea within its EEZ. For local communities on occupied features like Thitu Island, increased maritime pressure translates into concerns over access to fishing grounds, the safety of local residents, and the ability of law enforcement and Coast Guard units to operate freely. The Reed Bank incident also highlights the economic stakes. The Philippines is at an inflection point with energy. As output from Malampaya declines, policymakers have increasingly talked about tapping other offshore prospects to meet the country's growing electricity and energy needs. Reed Bank's potential gas reserves are often cited in those discussions. For Manila, allowing unfettered access to foreign surveyors and potential resource mapping by another claimant would be tantamount to losing control over future development. That explains why the Coast Guard and other government agencies treat research activity with elevated scrutiny. International legal frameworks matter in this conversation, but so does the reality of presence and control at sea. Manila's approach has relied on a mixture of legal assertion, diplomatic protest, and operational monitoring. Publicly documenting incidents, releasing patrol footage, and lodging diplomatic notes are all part of a strategy intended to assert legal rights while avoiding rapid escalation. The Philippines has also sought to deepen cooperation with partners that can assist in surveillance, capacity building, and maritime domain awareness without turning a regional contest into a direct military standoff. Security analysts warn that there are growing risks if these cycles of presence and contest continue. A civilian research vessel surrounded by militia boats and shadowed by Coast Guard cutters creates dense, ambiguous situations in which mistakes or miscalculations become more likely. Encounters at sea can be dangerous. Small boats can be damaged or capsize, and close maneuvers have produced collisions and near misses elsewhere in the region. Those incidents, if they involve lives or significant damage, can rapidly internationalize what might otherwise be a localized dispute. At the same time, there is a diplomatic avenue that regional leaders and international partners continue to explore. Confident its building measures clearer rules of engagement at sea and renewed emphasis on multilateral negotiation mechanisms could reduce the frequency of dangerous encounters. Many Southeast Asian nations have called for the full and effective implementation of a code of conduct in the South China Sea, a long-sought pact intended to manage behavior and prevent escalation. But progress on a binding code has been slow, and the presence of extra-regional powers and their rivalries has complicated consensus building. For the people who live on the islands and shoals of the Spratly Archipelago, these high-stakes maneuvers are not abstract. Fishermen complain of interference and of being pushed away from traditional fishing grounds. Small island communities worry about the safety of resupply convoys and about their long-term livelihoods. Manila insists that the Coast Guard's patrols will continue, that documentation will be thorough, and that the country will defend what it regards as lawful sovereign rights under international law. The immediate future depends on what happens next, whether research vessels and their supporting ships leave the area, whether patrols by Manila and its partners are stepped up, and whether diplomatic channels between the Philippines and China yield de-escalation. In the longer term, the dispute over Reed Bank highlights several inescapable realities. First, access to undersea resources and control of strategic waterways will remain a prime driver of regional tensions. Second, technology and improved maritime surveillance have made incidents more visible to the public and to partner governments, creating pressure for transparent responses. Third, the proliferation of different kinds of vessels, civilian, paramilitary, Coast Guard, and naval increases the complexity of maritime governance in shared seas. For now, Manila has chosen to emphasize monitoring, documentation, and diplomatic protest rather than immediate military escalation. The Coast Guard's release of patrol footage and statements is part of a deliberate effort to keep the incident in the public eye and to build international support for its position. Allies and partners, while wary of being drawn into direct confrontation, have signaled concern about coercive tactics at sea and have reiterated calls for restraint, adherence to international law, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. The Reed Bank confrontation will likely be analyzed in capitals from Manila to Washington, Beijing to Canberra, and regional capitals across Southeast Asia. Observers will be watching for whether this episode is a singular occurrence or part of a pattern of more frequent and sophisticated operations to establish presence and collect data in disputed waters. They will also be watching to see how Manila balances assertion of its rights with the need to avoid incidents that could spiral into broader conflict. As the situation unfolds, one thing is clear: disputed maritime spaces are not only zones of legal contestation, but practical arenas where strategy, data, and everyday livelihoods collide. The narrative of the South China Sea is as much about maps and law as it is about the everyday work of surveillance aircraft, Coast Guard cutters, small service boats, and the fishermen who navigate these waters. The stakes are high, the dynamics are complex, and the search for a stable, rules-based way to manage competition at sea remains one of the region's most urgent challenges.